Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's December 21st, 2021, and I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. It's the perfect time of year to pick up a great book, and we've got a couple recommendations for you today. Our first guest is Janisse Ray, author of Wild Spectacle: Seeking Wonders in a World Beyond Humans, which was just published in October by Trinity University Press. Ray tells us why she set out looking for heart-pounding flashes of wild spectacle in the first place, shares some stories of the places she traveled to for the book, and explains how and why she did all that traveling without getting in an airplane.
We need to be much, much harder on ourselves about our own entitlements, our own privileges, and how we're using the Earth's resources.
We also speak with Jordan Salama, a writer and journalist whose first book is called Every Day the River Changes, 4 Weeks Down the Magdalena, published just last month by Catapult, an imprint of Penguin Random House. Salama tells us about how and why he spent 4 weeks traveling down the Magdalena River in Colombia, why Colombians speak of the Magdalena River with an almost religious fervor, as he writes, and what he hopes people can take away from his book.
It's this river where so much has already been lost, but there's also the sense that there's a lot left to lose. There's enough fervor there that this heart of the country can still be preserved in a way that's beneficial both to people and nature, which is a really powerful thing.
Janisse Ray is a celebrated naturalist and activist and author who has won an American Book Award, a Pushcart Prize, and a Nautilus Book Award for her previous books. Her newly released 8th book, Wild Spectacle, is full of truly dazzling prose and deep, earthy wisdom, so it's not hard to imagine it winning some awards too. I asked her to tell us about the impetus for the book. Why did she want to visit and write about wild places?
I'm a nature writer more than anything else. I think that there are we all know there are lots of injustices in the world. And I don't think there's anything more important in this century than figuring out how we're going to live sustainable lives on the planet without destroying ourselves and everything we love, including things like free time. So I have devoted most of my work to this purpose, and I know a lot of writers would shy away from that. They would not want their work to be tainted by some ulterior motive. But I am really a preacher more than anything else. So this book it's my 8th, and most of my work focuses on nature in the South. This one is, jumps out of that category because I'm writing about places of wild spectacle that I've been able to see. It mainly takes place in North and South America, but that's what it's about. It's about wild spectacle. It's kind of a reminder of what we're fighting for. We get bad news so much, almost on an hourly basis, a minute by minute basis almost. But I really wanted to write about things that I've seen that future generations or even young people now may never get to see. I wanted to write about those and document it in a way, and also to document it in as beautiful and artful and poetic a language as possible.
Which I would say you did, because the writing is just gorgeous.
Thank you. I've been at it a long time, Mike, and I'm also, I also am very committed to the art form, to the craft of it all. Yep.
Yeah.
And equally committed to making change.
What is it about wild places that you find so intriguing? And were you hoping to learn something or experience something for yourself by visiting these places? Or was it more all about documenting them for future generations?
So more than anything, this is a collection of essays, and they took place over many years. So in past books, the books have had a narrative arc. So I entered into some space, hoping to learn something, learning something, and then sat down. And in this book, I've compiled just like the most amazing things that I've been able to see and experience. So the answer to that really lovely question is yes. in the entire process of exploring nature and being in wild places, I've wanted to become a better person, which is it's really what literature is all about, right? I mean, there are lots of ways that we as human beings transform. We can transform for the negative and we can transform for the positive. I am always rooting for us transforming into better versions of ourselves. So I'm always exploring anything, any journey, any introspection. It's always toward that end of, what do I have to learn here? And therefore, what can I help someone else learn? But I also want to answer that question with, from another angle. And that is, we are so engulfed, enamored, surrounded by the built environment, the constructed environment. And our relationship to the natural environment gets more and more removed, more and more watered down, ameliorated. And so when I think about our ancestors and the millennia, all the eons that have passed, I realize that there are so many things to learn about being in place and being on the land that we've never had a chance to learn. We've forgotten. And Mike, it's some of those things that I'm looking for. Can trees really talk to you? What can you learn by getting grounded, by sitting in a place? In the beginning, I talk about working with a native man named Oness. I was teaching down at Florida Gulf Coast University. And Oness, as part of the mitigation for the university being built in wetlands, every incoming student was required to take an environmental studies course. And Oness came to every one of those classes, like every section of those classes. And he did a talk on his Native American philosophy. He was Abenaki. And always at the classes, something amazing would happen in that he would take the class outside and some being, a turtle or an alligator or a bird would stop and come to listen to him. So I just thought that was pretty woo-woo. But when he came to my section of the class that I was teaching, my class was sitting out on the lawn in a circle. And I was so shocked to see a black racer with its head 6 inches out of the grass come like directly straight rolling through the grass toward us. It circled our group of students and just hunkered down behind Oness. And so think about that. Think about becoming the kind of person to whom animals want to listen. And so that was part of my writing too, is how can I be a voice for these other beings in the world? Extinction means so many things, but extinction also means the loss of parts of ourselves. But we're incredibly sensual people, and not just these five senses that we empiricists and Cartesians, we want to think about these five main senses, but think about these myriad other senses that we have: a sense of responsibility, a sense of being watched, a sense of place, a sense of time. And those, as we remove ourselves farther and farther from wildness, we lose those parts of ourselves, become extinct. So I'm exploring that in the book too. That's a very long answer to a wonderful question.
Well, you write about that in the book a little bit, about wanting to become the type of person animals want to listen to. And I'm curious if you think you got closer to being that kind of person through these travels to these wild places.
I think that I'm closer, but I think I'm a long way from where I would like to be. One thing happened recently. I was reading at the College of Environment and Design at the University of Georgia, and they had put me in front of this large bank of windows, and I didn't know it because it was happening behind me. But the whole time I was reading and talking, these banks of swallows were flying in those murmurations, those changing formations. So that made me feel hopeful, that maybe I can become some semblance of that person. Mike, I think a lot of this involves using this feeling sense. And it's not the feeling sense of like, I feel scared or, I feel this softness against my skin. It's more employing that sense that we have of what is really happening here. What is the tree really saying? What is that squirrel trying to tell me? Why did the elk show up? And I think that's a matter of practice, of sitting in silence and some form of meditation and sitting in some grounded fashion and listening not only with your ears and your eyes, but listening with your body. So it's sort of like this embodied way of being in the world. So I'm working on it. That's all I can say. Yeah, maybe in 10 years, we can have a conversation again and I can report. There is that one place in the book where I was swimming with manatees for a story. And this thing did happen where I felt I was in some kind of conversation with the manatee.
Well, that's the perfect lead into my next question, because you write that you have, in your luckiest moments, lived heart-pounding flashes of wild spectacle. What are some of the other examples of that you write about in the book?
I was lucky enough to be able to spend a month in Sitka, Alaska. And I went, thinking that the food that I would eat for that month would be mostly processed food. I live on an organic farm inland from Savannah, Georgia. So we're able here to produce a lot of good food, and food's important to me. And I think eating the food of place, foraged foods, wild foods helps make you wilder. I was unprepared for the volume and vastness of wildness that I experienced in Alaska. It was the time of the herring run when the herring are laying their roe on kelp. And that was attracting scores and scores of bald eagles. It's a place, of course, where there are plenty of whales and seals and all kinds of edibles, not only grizzly bears as well as others, and all kinds of fish. So I would have to point to that month I spent in Alaska and realizing that, we haven't laid our foot completely against the planet. And you would think, Mike, I know that you probably think this every day in your work, but you would think the planet is so huge. There's so many millions of years of evolution here. How could we, in this 100, 150, 200 year period, put our foot down so harshly against nature to where, we're now, destroying our atmosphere? And there was just that month in Alaska that I look back on and think, if it still exists here, then there's a chance that it can exist again anywhere. And there's hope for us, which brings us to hope, and it's the thing that so many of us in this field are struggling with all the time, which is, people ask me everywhere I go to do readings and talks, they're like, are you hopeful? How do you stay hopeful? Do you hang on to hope? And I used to say, it's beauty in nature that gives me hope. And I just look out, that big orange sun rising over these, this swamp to our east here where I am at home. And, a great crested flycatcher is calling out in the trees. But after a long time, I realized that was the wrong answer, that there's something else that's at work here, and it's not about hope at all. So hope implies action. Hopeless. If a person is hopeless, they're depressed, and that then implies paralysis, inaction, like deep depression. And I know lots of people are in that place, but it's not hope that keeps me going. It's really love. And so then our job becomes staying full of love, learning how to love something more deeply, more fully. And I think that's a very different thing than staying hopeful. So let me circle back around to your original question, which was to name a couple of places where I saw wild spectacles. And when I turned 40, I got my husband to take me, or for us to go to the place where monarch butterflies overwinter. And monarchs are just an iconic animal in most of our imaginations. When we got to the Sierra Madre, there had been a killing frost, a product of climate change, the climate crisis, a few weeks before. And over half of the monarchs there were dead. So I write about that because it's not actually, a wild spectacle. It was a wild spectacle of death. But recently I spoke to a monarch biologist, and she told me that in the 90s, when she went to this site, that she could walk for 45 minutes and just see masses and masses and masses of butterflies hanging. That this one colony lasted for a 45-minute walk. I mean, that's just crazy. It's just crazy to imagine that. It's crazy to imagine the hordes of passenger pigeons that were, once flying these skies above us, or the beauty of that giant woodpecker called ivory-billed, both of those things now extinct. I make a practice out of becoming as attached to the earth as possible, because that is the way to build love. It's to get out in it. It's to see what you can see. It's, what you don't know, you can't love. It's to get to know it. It's to study it. All those things leading up to, I get emotional here, but just leading up to some gigantic love.
Well, I think it speaks to the love and dedication with which you're approaching this, that you cover a lot of ground. You traveled all over the U.S. from Alaska to Montana and Florida, but also to Mexico, Belize, and Costa Rica. But you haven't flown on an airplane in over a decade, right?
Yeah, it's been 13 years now. I quit flying. I was being asked to fly, out to Portland and do a talk and at a bookstore, and there'd be 20 people at the talk. And I was preaching to people about how they should be living and realizing, look, this is a kind of insanity. When you don't walk your talk, it's really a schizophrenia or something. And so I just couldn't keep doing it. I love travel. I think there's so many benefits of travel, even eco travel, it's so important, but I could no longer justify it. Once I heard the writer and ecologist Gary Nabhan talk about eating local, and this was long before we had the 100-mile diet and this big movement about eating local, but at a conference many years ago, he was eating some percentage of his food, of his intake was coming from maybe a 50-mile radius or a 100-mile radius of his home in Arizona. And when I was sitting at lunch with him, and I was like, why are you doing this? And he said that he was doing it to weave his life back together. So how crazy our lives become with so much quick travel available to us, then 5 minutes becomes this very important thing in our lives. And you also, add to that the attention economy and social media and news from all over the world hitting us at every moment of the day. And that was the other reason, is I had to quit flying to weave my life back together. So I'm not saying that I will never fly again, but I am saying I have not been on an airplane of any kind in 13 years. So I did continue to do talks, but I travel by train now and by car. We have a Priya electric vehicle. I also travel when I can by bike and by foot. What happened is that I put a parameter on travel, meaning if I was invited to California, I had to think, do I want to spend 5 days on the train going to LA and 5 days back to do this event? And I think these are the questions that we all need to be asking ourselves. We need to be much, much harder on ourselves about our own entitlements, our own privileges, and how we're using the earth's resources. There will come a time when the gas that you use frivolously today, the fossil fuels, you will want another time for an ambulance to come pick you up. When you walk into a supermarket now, things look so normal. There's any kind of food that you could want are in our supermarkets, mostly. Maybe if you're inner city, that's not the case, and maybe in very, very rural places. But mostly we are confronted with this abundance and bounty and ease and convenience, which is a complete lie. Producing that food gets more and more difficult. My husband and I are worried about not having fruit this year because we've had no significant winter. It's the end of December. Normally, we would have had a frost by early October. We didn't even have a frost until late November this year. And if our fruit trees don't get a certain number of chill hours, then we won't have peaches and nectarines and plums and pears. And we just live on a little, homestead with small numbers of these things. So I want to say that the ease at which we are able to fly and to purchase is not the word that keeps coming is lie. And I don't like using that word, but it's really not the truth.
I was wondering if you feel that by not flying, it actually helps you get a little closer to the world you live in. You're not traveling strictly locally, but I'm still reminded of Thoreau's famous line about how he'd traveled much and conquered, which I always took to mean you don't need to travel to far-off exotic places to find meaning and purpose in life and to live your own authentic life. So by not flying, do you feel you're living more fully on the ground you're standing on, so to speak?
That's a very important quote from Thoreau that you mentioned. I completely agree. The third part of the book is divided into 3 sections, and that's really why the third part of the book is more local. By then I wasn't flying, and so my peregrinations were more local, more regional, more interior, deeper into place. Yeah, that is a goal of mine is, in the years that or in the time that I may have remaining, I do want to sink deeper and deeper into place and get to know it. And you're right, just making the decision not to fly is a big assist in that. I'm totally fascinated with this idea of place and our human relationship to place. And I think, too, our industrial capitalist society has wanted to take that away from us. Capitalism needs people to be able to go wherever for a career, a job, a program of study, and thus we get disconnected. And I think a deep connection of place to place is an essential part of the human psyche.
What do you think you personally took away from these travels and the process of writing this book? What did you learn, and in what ways did you grow? And do you recommend that others seek out wild places for similar types of learning and growth? And if so, how do you recommend they go be present in wild spaces without making them less wild?
Oh, yeah, good point. And isn't it interesting that the pandemic sort of gave that to us, that we were getting out more, all of it. When I say we here, I'm not talking about my family or me, but all of us were definitely taking to the wild. And I think something busted open with that, which is a wonderful thing. And hopefully the things that we learned in the pandemic by getting out on trails and so forth will lead to more protection for wild places, which desperately we need. In terms in the bigger picture, I think about there's a chapter at the end called "I've Seen the Warrior," and it's about canoeing. I had to rescue a kid in Okefenokee Swamp. We were crossing the swamp, which is a 3-day journey, and he happened to drink some big gulps of lamp oil. So it involved, pulling this kid back out of the swamp, getting him to help, and then paddling back in, including through many miles of being alone in a kayak in the middle of an alligator-filled swamp in the middle of the night. There was something that happened there that made me realize that most of our lives are asked to live small. But I think that we are mythic characters, and I think that our lives are mythic. And that's what I learned that evening is, the title "I've Seen the Warrior" is really, I saw this part of myself that is able to get big, is able to keep a focus on my present surroundings, but also keep a focus on the long view, a visionary focus on where we need to be going, and have the strength to do what needs to be done when we're called to action. I don't really know how that fits back in with your question, but that's just what came to me.
Just to wrap up our conversation here, can you say something about the importance of preserving these wild places to building a more sustainable future for all life on this planet?
Well, I think it's definitely essential to the future of life on the planet, because every large wild green space that we preserve is a place where we can allow the natural processes that sustain us to continue, and thus for us as humans to continue. So it's in these wildlife corridors and, open spaces that trees take in carbon and give off the oxygen we breathe, where the ground filters our water and stores our water, where we store carbon, where growing things take carbon out of the atmosphere and deposit it in their bodies, and on and on and on. Without large tracts of wild land, we cannot survive. So much of of society, so much of what we're surrounded with, like so many of the messages that we're getting, mainly through advertisements, but also all kinds of corporate messaging, is directing us away from our animal natures, away from wildness. And that's a mistaken direction. We are animal. We are biological beings, 100% reliant on the services of the earth. So I think then, because the messaging draws us away from our true selves and our true places in the world, that we have to make concerted efforts to combat that, to reconfigure our lives so that we can be as big a people, as big a being, physically, spiritually, and otherwise, as we were meant to be. So that's going to take, Mike, us personally making the decisions to get outside in nature, to get to know our places, to put the processes of the earth before manufacturing processes, for example, and on and on, to stay home more, to ground ourselves more, literally ground ourselves with bare feet on the earth, I mean, there are many, many ways. I think so much about rewilding, and there are many, many ways to rewild. So if a person listening to you and me talk this morning is interested in this, I would send them to just Google rewilding and start doing on a daily basis the things that will bring you closer to your true self. And then that brings meaning to your life. So we're living in so many paucities, and one is, a lack of meaning, a lack of connection, a lack of feeling of belonging. And so much of that is due to our divorce from nature. So that really is the whole entire huge premise of the book, is to bring us back to our own true selves.
The Magdalena River is nearly 1,000 miles long and cuts right through the heart of Colombia. Jordan Salama spent 4 weeks traveling the entire length of the river, and not always by boat, as you might expect, but we'll discuss that shortly. His first book, Every Day the River Changes, documents his journey down the river and the many people he meets on the river's banks. But exactly why did he find himself undertaking this journey and writing this book?
Actually, how I got to Colombia in the first place is kind of a bit of a coincidence. I was born and raised in New York, but my family kind of comes from all over the place. I have relatives who were born in Iraq. My mother actually was born in Baghdad. My father's family are Syrian Jews from Damascus and Aleppo who made their way to the United States via Argentina. So I have Middle Eastern background, I have Latin American background, and I've kind of always been interested in Latin America as a region. When I was a freshman in college, I had a chance to do an internship with an environmental organization with the Wildlife Conservation Society somewhere in Latin America, and I wasn't sure where it was going to be. But they called me one day and they told me that I would go to Colombia. And when that happened and I started telling people here, both at school and in my family, everybody was kind of just terrified on my behalf. Colombia in this country has a reputation, a particular, maybe even you could say stigma, for being a place of violence, of war, of narcos, and people were just not happy about it. The only person who was this family friend. Actually, she taught me how to play the piano when I was 5 years old. Her name was Sandra. And Sandra, when I called her and told her that I had a chance to go to Colombia, she said, "Oh my God, you can stay with my grandmother. She'll take care of you." And I was very excited about this, and that was enough to convince me that I could go because I'd have a place to stay with someone who I knew. Turned out that her grandmother was 96 years old and couldn't get out of bed. And she locked the door every night at 7 p.m. And I wouldn't be allowed to kind of leave the house. But in those nighttime curfews, she was being very kind. And obviously, it was her way of trying to keep me safe. I would start to keep journals documenting who I had met, the experiences I'd had, the places I'd been. And for the first time in earnest, I was actually working as a journalist, it seemed, without realizing it, because I was writing about those things for the first time. Fast forward a couple of years later, I'm trying to find a topic for my senior thesis in college, and I look back at those journals and I remember that everybody was telling me there was this place, the Magdalena River. To understand Colombia, you had to understand this river, and everybody was telling me that I should go there. And I wanted to understand Colombia because it's this kind of vastly diverse, it's many nations within one nation is a better way of putting it. It has so many different kinds of peoples, cultures, languages, also landscapes and species. And the combination of all those things made for a kind of very interesting place for me, somebody who also is a kind of weird mix of people and cultures and languages in one. So I traveled down the Magdalena because I thought maybe it would provide a cross-section to a country in transition. And that is exactly what I ended up finding.
You write about how Colombians speak of the Magdalena River with an almost religious fervor. And as you just said, that they feel in order to really know Colombia, you have to know that river. Can you tell us about its features, its ecology, and why it's so important to Colombians?
Definitely. So the river starts in the south, in the Andes, and it flows north about 950 miles towards the Caribbean Sea, where it empties in Barranquilla, a city on the coast. Along the way, it passes through Andean mountains, through deserts, through swamplands, through jungles, through deforested jungles that are now kind of more like savannas and pastures, all these sorts of landscapes. And there's just a kaleidoscope of species that are endemic to this river basin. And for a long time, it was really important to the economy of the country because it was this kind of throughway from the coast to a spot about midway down where you could then take either a mule caravan or later a train to get to the capital. So it was the way that people would get from the coast to the capital, which was inland, kind of landlocked. So it became this very, very important kind of artery for the heart of a nation. But what ended up happening was that meant that the river was overused and kind of plundered and pillaged, as they say. Deforestation along both the banks led to the sedimentation of the river. It became very shallow, and now it's unnavigable by most passenger boats. So the very river that was kind of the heart of the glory of this old version of Colombia was what contributed to that very glory contributed to the river's demise. And now the river is kind of a shadow of what it once was, but that doesn't mean that there's still not this amazing level of ecology and biodiversity along its banks. I met people who are working to save critically endangered river turtles along the Magdalena. I met countless social leaders and environmental activists who are advocating against fracking and mining and dams to try to save what's left of the river to maybe try to build back in a more ecologically friendly way. So it's this river where so much has already been lost, but there's also this sense that there's a lot left to lose, that there's enough fervor there that this heart of the country can still be preserved in a way that's beneficial both to people and nature, which was a really powerful thing.
You also write that passenger boats don't travel the length of the river anymore, so you traveled by boat, bus, and even improvised motobalinera.
Correct.
Tell us about your journey.
So when you speak of a riverboat journey, or when you speak of a river journey, I should say, most people think it's a journey by boat. But because of the situation that I just described, you cannot take a boat for most of the length of the Magdalena anymore. So what I did was I was kind of forced to travel by land along its banks, and that pushed me through the very communities that live alongside it. So while most of what has been written about the Magdalena in the past has kind of been written by people who are afforded the possibility of sitting on a boat, floating down the river and looking outwards, I was pushed through the communities, and the river was kind of a constant alongside my journey. But really the heart of this story are the local voices, the people who I met along the way. But yeah, I mean, I traveled by however I could, really. One trip was with Colombian anthropologists. We hung on the back of a pickup truck for 2 hours while it swerved in and out of the winding roads of the Andes looking for megalithic statues in the mountains. The motobalinera that you mentioned is the craziest form of transportation that I think I've ever been on in my life. It's a wooden platform with railroad wheels on the bottom, and it's powered by a motorcycle that pushes it along a railroad track that supposedly is abandoned. But then later they tell you that actually, oh yeah, a freight train goes through just every week or so. But don't worry, we know when it comes. But if it just happens to surprise us, just be ready to jump just in case. And so I'm here. So as you know, the freight train didn't come, but you can see that there's just this wide range of different kinds of transportation that made for a very interesting adventure. But also, it is indicative, I think, of what people have to go through in a place where there's just not that many resources. So it's both kind of makes for this exciting part of the quote-unquote adventure story, but also I hope that in many cases, such as the Motobalinera, where this one town is hard to access if not for this contraption along a railroad, it shows you what people go through when the state maybe leaves them behind.
Tell us more about some of the people you met on the banks of the Magdalena. Do any of their stories in particular stand out to you?
Yeah, there are a few. I mean, there are some really special people who I meet along this river. It's the most storied, one of the most storied rivers in Latin America for a reason, and I think people have been attracted to it for a long time for a reason. And the people I met were no exception to that. I met a school teacher who for 20 years has been running a traveling library on a donkey. Two donkeys named Alfa and Beto, alfabeto in Spanish, alphabet in English, obviously, to bring books to rural school children who don't have access to libraries so that they can learn to read at home. I met a man who builds wooden canoes. For years and years, he's just been building wooden canoes on the banks of the river. Another man who, for 79 of his 89 years, has been sitting on his front stoop, crafting silver and gold filigree jewelry, these like little, really intricately designed pendants, little fishes, hats, flowers, tiny little things to put as earrings or as a necklace or a bracelet. But for 79 years, he's been sitting in the same place doing the same thing. And a long time ago, when the river stopped being so navigable, he lost almost all of his customers. So hardly anyone was coming to buy his things anymore, but he couldn't stop making these jewels. So much so that in a glass cabinet beside him, they were just piling up over the decades, really. And I was really inspired by this man. Simón Villanueva was his name. And he kept saying over and over and over, I live in love with my work. And he was so passionate about what he does, about creating these little pockets of beauty in a world that he said was kind of filled with struggle and conflict. And that really stuck with me. I think that this book is filled with resilient people who are creating pockets of beauty in a world filled with, for a long time, conflict and struggle. And so that's one thing that I hope people will take away from this, to say like, okay, this is a book about a place that definitely has a lot of problems. And we don't shy away from those problems whatsoever. We talk about what that means for the country, what it means for regular people, but also what it means on a kind of global scale. At the same time, there is so much here that's trying to preserve fleeting moments of beauty through ordinary, extraordinary people doing amazing things.
So the decades-long armed conflict in Colombia keeps coming up for obvious reasons, perhaps. Did you find the specter of that conflict really still looming over the river and the people living there?
Certainly, in every way, in every encounter, there were legacies and remnants and maybe even present-day implications of the conflict in kind of every encounter that I had. There was a town where bodies would come floating down the river, and in decades past, when those corpses were really in large number, people in the town started pulling them out of the river and giving them graves. So graves for the disappeared, because they thought it would bring blessings to the people in their family who were disappeared by the conflict, and hoping that maybe someone would be repaying the favor somewhere else. In another situation, I went with a group of biologists and environmental leaders on a riverboat journey to look for invasive hippopotamuses. The Magdalena River is the only place in the world outside of Africa where hippopotamuses are wild and invasive species. And that's because Pablo Escobar had a zoo of exotic animals from other continents. And when he was killed, the only ones that they couldn't deal with, bring to a zoo or bring back to release into the wild, were these hippopotamuses that ended up escaping and proliferating. Now there's like 100 of them living in the Magdalena River, and it's a real problem for the people who are farmers and fishermen. But of course, in the United States, when those hippopotamuses are reported on, it is seen as kind of a cartoonish joke. So all of this is trying to push back against the fetishizing and exaggeration of all of these issues and looking at it as the real kind of human problems that they are. And then in terms of the environment, I mean, the environment acts as an agent in war, but it's also a victim of war. In Colombia, it's so interesting that in pockets where, in areas where the FARC, the largest guerrilla group in the country, was very active, for a long time there was no deforestation because groups like loggers and illegal gold miners didn't want to go in because they were afraid of the FARC. But when the FARC demobilized in 2016, deforestation skyrocketed, as you guys have reported on actually quite a lot, in those areas where the guerrilla groups vacated, because suddenly there was no longer this informal protection, quote unquote, of the forest. Not that the FARC were environmentalists in any way, but just by their presence, by being there, by there being conflict in these very rural forested areas, the forests were kind of somehow protected, which is really interesting how these groups used the environment to their advantage. But then when they left, the environment suffered.
So changing gears a little bit here, I just have to ask, because here in my house, we are very big fans of John McPhee. And for those who don't know, he's a nonfiction writer with dozens of books, all of which are brilliant. And he's also a professor at Princeton, and I understand you studied under him, correct?
His class was what basically taught me what creative nonfiction is. I was a sophomore in college. I did not know what kind of writer I wanted to be. I knew I wanted to tell stories, but like, I really wasn't sure what that was going to look like. And then I took his class, and he basically taught all of us that a career could be made, if you were lucky, of spending time with really interesting people and learning about them, and then sharing that knowledge with others. And that really stuck with me. And I think it has stuck with me ever since. He encouraged me to do projects like this. So I'm very grateful to him. Reading his work that year was extremely influential in my figuring out what projects I wanted to work on while I was in school, which ended up being a lot of the projects that I started to work on after school, also like kind of in continuation. Looking at what kinds of stories he chased or what he was interested in, it really inspired me because I found myself interested in the same kinds of stories. That was really special because I was looking at this amazing person, this amazing writer who was able to make a life of telling the exact kinds of stories that I didn't yet realize I was interested in, but was starting to figure it out. That was really cool.
Yeah, the thing that always impresses me is how John McPhee can write about things that other people might find so commonplace as to be barely noticeable. And he can make it seem like that's the most important and interesting thing anyone has ever done, just by the way he writes about it. And I feel like your book does that too, finding great stories where others might just see the quotidian, and perhaps that's why John McPhee was even kind enough to provide a blurb for your book. But ultimately, what do you feel like you learned or took away from traveling down the Magdalena?
Well, it's kind of precisely what you were just talking about, right? That there is beauty and meaning in the most everyday of encounters, and even in the places where we might least expect it. That was for sure. I started out this journey in the sense of like this whole reporting journey from back when I was 19 years old and in Sandra's 96-year-old grandmother's house under 7 p.m. curfew in a place where everybody told me not to go, where everybody was terrified for me. And yet across those, now that was almost 6 years ago, in all of my travels in Colombia, and I've been back time and time again, all I've found is kindness. And again, that's not to say that there are not issues in a place. And again, this book spends plenty of time on those issues, and hopefully is a good introduction for people who are looking for a brief foray into Latin American history, into Colombian history, and its ever-changing present. But despite all of that, what I found was that oftentimes in the United States, we have these preconceived notions about a country, and we'll just say that name of that country and pretend that it's all one singular thing. And we tend to develop one singular opinion of that country based on what we're watching on TV or what we've heard about in the news. But oftentimes it's much deeper than that. And this book, hopefully through the stories of just kind of normal but extraordinary people, shows that things are always deeper than they may seem.
And what do you hope your readers take away from the book?
I mean, that right? Like in many ways, that what on a journey like this, what the writer learns is oftentimes what the people who read it are going to learn too, because they're coming on this journey with me. They're seeing this world through my eyes, just as I saw it for the first time. They're seeing it for the first time too. And that's ultimately what I just told you about things being deeper and finding beauty in places where you least expect it. Those are all the sorts of messages that I hope the reader will take away, because that's what I took away when I was there. And I think that when we experience a place, just like when we read a book or when we play a cover of a song, we are interpreting our own version of that work of literature or of that place or of that song or of that poem or whatever it is. And just as I went to Colombia and had my experience there, this aims to be nothing more than one young person's journey down a river. I hope that others, by reading this book, will be able to make their own reading of Colombia and of the people who I met, but also be encouraged to go out and find that meaning and that beauty, maybe just, a couple blocks away from their door. Because you can be a travel writer anywhere. You don't have to go to a faraway place. You can do it in New York. You can do it in California. You can do it anywhere.
If you enjoy the Manga Bay Newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/mangabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/mangabay to learn more and support the Mangabay Newscast. You and your friend can join the listeners who've downloaded the Mangabay Newscast more than 250,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mangabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mangabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/mangabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @mangabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mangabay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.